We've been to a lot of storms here, so. Oh, this? Oh, nice. My legs are painful. Oh, wow. You guys are one of our clients. You would have gotten what I don't understand why they like. I mean, you guys pay us.
I'm discussing plan to begin Florida budget and course press conference, which was submitted. For those of you joining us on Zoom meeting, that is joining us on Zoom, you can type your questions into the chat box.
Could you give me one more mic check? Can I get one more mic check? You have it.
You got some?
No,
Both.
neither of us.
Say, George, maybe, is this already plugged in or no?
Yeah. I was told that this one's due to work. Something like that.
So we just need to check back there. So the microphone's working, more pause.
All right, let's see what's the deadline. Hasn't been conveyed for the website this morning. But, right. Sometimes it is. Yes. Yeah.
Just troubleshooting. Could you go straight from the bottom?
Good. From that and thinking I'm going to start.
It's also. It's easy to.
Okay, yeah.
There's
Whatever you need.
always something.
Yeah.
Although. I may just go on. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll be able to talk to your guys today.
Let's see.
Yeah. Microphone. So probably those that are on Zoom, maybe text me, if it sound any better. Also going live on a YouTube channel. Go ahead, TaxWatch on YouTube, so that's better set up. Like they. Do that. Now. Or bigger than. Put that order. Well, we just need, to call you.
Yeah, I know that. I don't understand.
Kind of still on video, this is still on video, but not.
I don't know.
Well, we can do that. Yeah. We can do that. We'll just.
Where were you on Snake Day?
Snake Day?
Snake Day, man.
When was Snake Day?
A few weeks ago. Snake Day. And what was it?
Oh.
And like
Oh,
right now or something.
wow.
They had
All right, folks, thanks for your patience. We'll have sound in just a minute. If you didn't hear me, you'll know. You will have sound. You will have sound in just a minute.
So,
Write it down. You want to put that second shot? Oh, yeah. Well, okay.
Outside. That's what we're. You couldn't get in.
oh wow.
Couldn't get in, so we had to park over there and then hop the fence just to get.
What?
outside. And so, I mean,
Really?
finally, when we hop the fence, this was inside. You know, this is-
Oh, wow.
yeah, we hopped the fence over there. Yeah. I saw that line. This,
So you can make the drive up and send me the language, right?
beginning of this,
Okay.
so that tree here, right here, that line right there is what caused us from getting power back. Like
One
that was-
line.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't have a. The nothing is that high. It's gonna be here on the.
No, so there's these, there it is, like Eastern Indigo stuff. They went, started on exchange for the.
All right, folks, can you hear me now? Apologies for the disruption. Sound test, if you guys can just chat. Yeah, if it's working, if you can hear us out there, please let us know via chat. Are we good to go? Can folks hear us out there? Again, our apologies. Very important report that we have. Let me turn this over to our General Counsel and Executive Vice President, Lieutenant Governor Jeff Kottkamp. Thank you.
Good morning. Again, my name is Jeff Kottkamp. I have the pleasure of being the Executive Vice President and General Counsel here at Florida TaxWatch. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Kurt Winter, Senior Vice President of Research here at Florida TaxWatch, and really one of the leading experts in Florida on the state budget. And he's the lead researcher on our annual Budget Turkey Watch report, also joined by the other members of our amazing research team here at Florida TaxWatch who helped Kurt go through this very detailed budget. Before we get started, I want to thank you for joining us both in person and virtually for the release of the 2024 Budget Turkey Watch report. This is Florida TaxWatch's independent review of the state budget. This annual report promotes additional oversight and integrity in Florida's budgeting process and is based on the principle that because money appropriated by the legislature belongs to the taxpayers of Florida, the budget process must be transparent and accountable. And every project should receive proper deliberation and public debate. Those that don't are labeled budget turkeys. These appropriations projects or budget turkeys violate sound budgeting principles in at least one of the following ways. One, they circumvent established review and selection processes, or they have passed through the established process but are funded ahead of much higher priority projects. Think of the road, the 5-year road plan and how they're prioritized and having projects either jump the list or being added. Two, they are inserted for the first time in the budget during conference committee meetings, meaning they did not appear in either the final House or Senate budget. Three, they do not adhere to the rules adopted by the Senate or House for appropriations or member projects. Four, they have been in the Senate or House budget, but were removed during the budget conference only to be added back at the last minute. Now they're calling that the sprinkle list. Or five, they are funded through inappropriate trust funds, duplicative appropriations, or appropriations contingent on legislation that did not pass. You know, when I was in the House, I chaired an appropriations committee, so I've been at that inner conference room in the budget suite. When I was Lieutenant Governor, I sat at that conference table at the mansion when we went through the budget step by step. So I'm intimately familiar with the budget process, and I understand just how important this Florida TaxWatch annual budget turkey report is. To be clear, by no means are we passing judgment on a project's merit, value, or need. With this report, we are simply holding legislators accountable. We are telling them clearly, yes or no, whether they have followed the long-standing legislatively established process their tax-paying constituents both demand and deserve. Yes, government investment should be meaningful, and spending should make a positive, lasting difference in our community. But at the same time, there must be transparency and opportunities for public input before a project makes it into the budget. This year's Florida TaxWatch has identified 450 appropriation projects worth $854.6 million that qualify as budget turkeys. That's 450 appropriation projects worth $854.6 million. We have also flagged $912.2 million in specific line items, as well as over 1,600 member projects totaling $2.8 billion that we believe deserve a special scrutiny. While we commend Senate President Kathleen Passidomo, Speaker Paul Renner, and their respective chambers for their good stewardship of taxpayer dollars, we should note that both budget turkeys and member projects have proliferated at an accelerated rate in recent years. This is a trend we believe is wholly unsustainable, and Kurt will talk more about that in a moment. Finally, and as usual, we encourage Governor Ron DeSantis to assess each project we have presented a concern about here on this turkey list and determine, one, whether its funding is counter to sound budgeting practices, two, whether it addresses a core state government function, and or three, whether it was selected through a fair process that promotes the best interest of tax-paying citizens here in Florida. And now I'll turn it over to Kurt, who will talk you through some of the details of our report. Kurt.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to all of you for coming. 2024 marked the fourth year in a row that the Florida legislature has enjoyed huge budget surpluses that were generated by the record-setting revenue growth we've had. And the benefit of all this spending has been significant. They've done historical investments in critical needs like infrastructure, the environment, healthcare, and they've been able to do that while still continuing to cut taxes, reduce debt, and maintain sufficient reserves. However, as Jeff mentioned, budget turkeys and local member projects have gotten somewhat out of hand, to say the least. The steadily increasing number of member projects in particular is certainly a cause for concern, and member projects make up the majority of budget turkeys are member projects. 8 years ago, the Florida legislature adopted some new rules for member projects, which they call appropriations projects. At that time, then Speaker Corcoran said these were needed to address what he called the epidemic of these new budget earmarks. Those helped with transparency. I don't think they've helped a lot with review and deliberation over the projects, and they certainly haven't helped with stemming the tide of rising member projects. Since that time, 8 years ago, the number of member projects that made it into the budget have almost tripled, and reaching 1,600 this year. And the dollar amount has increased sevenfold. This means that on average, each of the 160 legislators were able to secure 10 member projects at an average of over $17 million each. Now, if you look at just the Senate and you consider that most member projects were recommended by both chambers, someone in both chambers did. So even though it might not have come through the Senate the Senate budget, each senator got an average of 40 projects, which to me is pretty remarkable. This marks the third year in a row that the total amount of member projects in the budget is over $2.8 billion. Get my things mixed up here. We've seen that member projects can be used really as negotiation chips, and sometimes they take precedent over the rest of the budget, which should always be the responsibility. Our feeling is there's way too many member projects to do a thorough review of them and make sure that they're spending money in best interest of the taxpayers. What's more, most member projects serve a local need and rely on funding that could otherwise address statewide issues or even be returned to the taxpayer. You have to remember that the budget, even without member projects, sends billions of dollars down to the local governments and or local areas and local governments. Now, these can also include a lot of the kinds of projects that member projects also do. You know, there's all sorts of grant processes for cultural things, historic preservation, local parks. All these have state processes that the legislature established to go through. So the state is spending a lot of money on local governments, even without member projects. So that raises the question, should the state be funding these additional member projects that are truly local, especially when they might be more of a luxury than a necessity and there's no assurance that taxpayers are protected? Florida TaxWatch recommends that if the legislature is going to continue funding such projects moving forward, they must create more statutorily defined competitive review processes for each of the following areas where member projects have been a glaring problem. There's the local transportation projects, housing and community development projects, school and instructional enhancements, private colleges and university projects, special law enforcement projects, local fire service, economic development projects, local emergency management, and workforce projects. And of course, y'all probably know of the local water projects, which is a huge list this year, about 280 different items. You know, Florida TaxWatch last year recommended that the state create a work program similar, but at a lot smaller scale than what DOT does with transportation, to better plan comprehensively what kind of projects should be funded. The way they do member projects certainly doesn't meet that goal. Florida's still in excellent fiscal shape, but we know this phenomenal run of revenue growth is not going to last. You know, we still have significant reserves. There are about $5.1 billion in unobligated general revenue expected to be left over by this budget. But if you look back just a couple of years ago, at the end of the year, there's over $20 billion in unobligated revenue. So we've been spending that down pretty significantly. We must focus on the future and implement strategic changes, such as those outlined in our report. Something must be done to limit the number of member projects and budget turkeys. I look forward to addressing specific questions you may have, but I think Jeff has some final remarks he'd like to make. Hope I didn't steal any of yours.
Since our founding in 1979, Florida TaxWatch has proudly served as our state's trusted government watchdog and taxpayer research institute, providing Florida's legislators and policymakers with thoughtful recommendations to secure enduring fiscal accountability and strength for the Sunshine State. We will never stop advocating for the taxpayers of Florida, which is exactly what we were doing with the release of the 2024 Budget Turkey Report today. We anticipate working with Governor Ron DeSantis and our state leaders to implement these measures, increase accountability for every taxpayer dollar spent, and ensure the greatest possible return on investment for all Floridians. I want to thank you again for being here and covering this important development. We're happy to answer any questions that you have, and if you're covering this on Zoom, we would ask you to simply enter your questions through the chat portion of the app, and we will read out loud your questions and answer them. So questions? Yes, sir.
I'm curious how to actually reform member projects when it's in the best interest of members to keep them going.
Well, I got to tell you, one of my concerns here is we're starting to get to the point that members don't know any different. You know, this wasn't that long ago. It was pretty unusual to have members have more than a handful of member projects in the budget. And so that's one of the reasons the Turkey Report is so important. It's a reminder that, look, this is the taxpayers' money. It's not just because we have the extra revenue, we have to spend it. We don't have to spend it. So it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure. But other than to do this and be really the watchdog that we are and say, look, no, this isn't the best way to do this. We should, particularly the sprinkle list. We shouldn't be behind closed doors sprinkling hundreds of millions of dollars into the budget. We have a process. We have months of committee meetings to vet these projects, to have public input, to have debate on the floor. And that process works. When we do it, it's a great process, and we should continue to rely on it when we're spending taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, there has been some changes, and we'd like to think that we had something to do with that. You know, like I said, those appropriation project rules that they passed have helped you and others to have access to actually what they're recommending. You know, they've kind of lessened that over the years. They started doing things like only like paying for the local transportation projects, which we've always flagged as being something that would take projects out of the work program and fund it with general revenue, which we have recommended. So they're doing things like that, creating more competitive grant processes for things. So they have made some improvements. The problem is that more and more member projects, I think it was the House and Senate both had 2,700 member project requests, both over $7 billion. You know, that's way too many to do any kind of thoughtful review. So they got to do something, I think, to limit the number of projects that are requested in the first place.
Yeah, Lieutenant Governor, my question is about higher education. A number of projects that are listed as questionable or you highlighted are in the state college and the state universities. However, a project that is not, that I don't see here, which has gotten some attention, is $3 million for the Lemieux Public Policy Center at Palm Beach Atlantic University, a private Christian institution. And you know, the broader question is, of course, former Senator George Lemieux has been very publicly identified as with TaxWatch for a long time, and a respected community person as well. But do people with, you know, alliances with TaxWatch get some sort of special dispensation, or why should $3 million to a private institution be okay, and yet some of these projects in the state college and universities are not okay?
It's a good question, a fair question, and just as an example, and Kurt might be able to answer this better than me on Pat.
Yeah, okay.
You want to talk about Pat, and I'll weigh in too, but on Pat's as an example.
Yeah, well, to answer your question about dispensation, we've had I'm starting to expect a lot of phone calls from members that are upset any day, any minute now. So we don't give a special dispensation. You know, one of the things we recommend, we say in the report, that those private college, and we've been saying this for years, the private college and university projects need to have a process for funding. They don't, so they don't meet our Turkey criteria, but they are in these areas that we've said need additional scrutiny by the governor and recommend that he look at them closely. The Lemieux Center is funded outside of PICO, and that's what we focus on is PICO because there's a process set up for that. The legislature has done, they made some real improvements to it. And the idea being that they quit starting new projects before they start funding new ones. Because really, construction doesn't start until all the money is appropriated. And they seldom appropriate all the money. So we've pointed out where they ignore the priority projects, a lot of the high priority projects that the universities and colleges have identified, and start new projects that weren't even recommended at the expense of these other ones that are sitting waiting for funding to get started.
And what I wanted to point out too is it was either a chairman of Florida TaxWatch, either the year he was chairman or the year after, had a very significant project in the budget. It made the turkey list. I just want to remind you that we're not opining on the merits of these projects. It's whether they followed the process. And so whether or not something should be in the budget, if it followed the process, that's a legislative priority, but we're not saying it's good or bad as far as the merits.
And a related question, if I may, that is, this effect, in the legislature, just about every city and county, even small cities, employ contract lobbyists whose sole mission is to get these projects approved, correct? And so I'm asking, take us behind the curtain a little bit and tell us what kind of lobbying you're subjected to, if any, from these contract lobbyists whose effectiveness is based on whether these projects get to the finish line.
Kirk can speak for himself. I very rarely contacted, had a few questions whether or not a project was on the list or was going to be on the list, but really haven't been lobbied on the merits of a project. Kurt, anything else to add?
Yeah, we do get contacted by people, whether it be lobbyists or just supporters of whatever the project is. And we tell them simply that, is we're not looking at whether it's a good project. So you don't have to sell us on whether or not this is going to be something good. We just want to make sure that it follows the good budgeting processes that were set up. If it doesn't, it's going to be on the list. If it doesn't follow them, it will be on the list. If they do follow them, it won't be. And so that's what we try to tell everybody.
I was going to say, you talk about the accelerated use of member projects. Have you looked into or discussed looking at the accelerated and increased use of legislation to budget outside the budget, where there's bills,
We've looked at it. I mean, we in our annual taxpayer guide to the budget, we list all the appropriations that are done in general bills, if that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of that, a lot more than there has been. The only real problem I have with that, I think that when you do it within a bill, you know what it is that you're funding. It's a better tie. They have to vote on it. Everybody has to vote on it. Not everybody ends up voting on the final budget until it's conference, and you can't vote it down. You can't change it. So we think that kind of spending gets more review. And so I don't think we have a problem with them doing that. I do think that they need to count that when they tell everybody how much money the budget is.
Go to the chat real quick. I'm going to combine two questions. It's what is the single biggest turkey this year? And is the bottom line of $854 million the biggest you ever identified?
It is the biggest. And if you mean by dollar amount, I'd have to check that. But there's I think a land purchase that was 35 million might have been the biggest dollar amount. But yeah, there's been some big ones. That's another thing. Member projects, if they were over $1 million, that was a lot. They are tens of millions of dollars now. I think we had $100 million one a year or so ago. So that's growing too.
Okay, related to the sprinkle list, at the close of budget negotiation, things have become normalized. Has the governing legislature given enough direction on what's acceptable and not related to sprinkle list?
Has the legislature given enough? No, I mean, that's the problem, is they don't. We've recommended that they do away with those. you know, we can understand if there's a little bit of money left over and they decide, okay, we're going to add money to some kind of statewide existing program, like, you know, teacher salaries or something. Adding money to that when you find out you have money left over isn't as bad. It's not the best approach, but it's not as bad as funding something brand new, local member projects, increasing member projects above what was even recommended by the member request. So we don't think that sprinkle lists at all are a good idea. We'd like to see them do away with it. Some of the stuff they do add a lot of good programs, money to good programs in the sprinkle list.
So you mentioned that over the past 8 years that a number of projects, do you have any information as to why?
You can answer that too. I mean, I think a lot of it is just, you know, attitudes towards member projects seem to have changed. You know, I've been around a long time looking at this, and there used to be far less of them. And it used to be kind of a wink thing, you know, they were a little sheepish about saying it, but, you know, they're trying to do something for their constituents and they're proud of that. But they always knew that they were turkeys or whatever they wanted to call them at the time. I think that the rules that they passed have helped to increase the number because, you know, if it's available and all we have to do is fill out a form, let's go ahead and do it. Let's do as many as we can to see if they get funded. A couple legislators have had over 100 requests this year. So
I can just, it's a little bit of a culture change. When I first got elected to the House, what happens is the speaker sends out a committee preference form. And when I filled out mine, I put my preferences, but also said, I don't want to be on an appropriations committee. So I didn't really come up here to spend money. And so we've seen over time a shift in mindset. And I think it may be, as Kurt just said, one of the things is if there's a form you fill out for member projects, well, that must mean you're supposed to ask for member projects. And so it is a concern that we're starting to develop a culture where members are unaware of the fact that they don't have to do that. They don't have to spend anything if they don't want to, other than, you know, what we're doing through the committee process.
I want to ask the transportation related question, because if you touched on it briefly, this budget funds some local transportation projects, not just by using general revenue, but by reaching into the statutorily approved 5-year work program, $250 million.
right.
And to make this relevant, maybe to viewers and to taxpayers, if I'm correct, projects that have already been approved, you know, somebody's waiting for a road to be finished in Sumter County or something. That project might not get done because of political favoritism shown in this budget, right?
Absolutely. And if you go back over years, we have historically called every local transportation project a turkey for that very reason. Takes money out of the state transportation trust fund, which means it's going to affect the work program. And last year, I think it was last year, they did something we've been recommending, and they funded all of the local transportation projects out of general revenue. That doesn't displace anything. It's still not a good process. They need to come up with a better way to prioritize them all, to figure out they're getting the ones that help the most. This year, there was, like you said, there was a split. Some were general revenue and some were local government. Really, most of the ones that were general revenue got both. So you'll see there's a lot of duplication in there. So what we decided to do this year with that is instead of listing them all out as turkeys, we would call on the governor to say, look at each of these closely and see if, you know, if they're really things that we should be doing.
Yeah, Steve, I mean, it's the reason we have the work plan, you know, is to have this coordinated, comprehensive, thoughtful, step-by-step projects. And so when we're jumping the list or we're adding things that aren't on the list, you're diminishing the whole purpose of the work plan, or it could be even on the PICO funding. I mean, there's a thoughtful process put in place that we should rely on. You got a question back there?
Yes, sir, I think we described it as a culture shift. I'm curious, what do you think is driving that culture shift? So over the course of the years, is it either external private interests that have led to like all these member projects, or is it just lawmakers are realizing, hey, as good for business, we can do that?
I think more it's just kind of the nature of term limits, you know, each couple of years, you know, we've seen a little bit more increase to the point where we don't have as many members, who have been in the legislature when it was rare for there to be member projects. So it's just a slow drip of culture change.
Yeah, if you're a freshman and you come in and you realize that last year they, members got $2.8 billion worth of projects for their local areas, you know, they're gonna do it too. They're gonna think, well, this must be the way it's done. So I'm gonna ask for a bunch of things as well. So I think the term limits probably does have a lot to do with it.
Great, any other questions? All right, we're done with the chat. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.
Let's just put on the chat, the audio, video is available at YouTube at Florida TaxWatch. Check out as well, but we'll also send that. And thank you for.
Thank you.